raising hands and letting people speak. We will just do the questions using that function. And finally, as I mentioned at the start, for anyone who missed it, I want to repeat that you're able to listen to the presentation in French or in English by clicking the interpretation button and picking the channel of your preference. And as you just heard, we've just started recording this presentation, and we'll be sharing that recording in the coming days. And now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Lois to introduce our speakers today.
Hello, everyone. Today we'll be hearing from knowledge holder Colleen Seymour, Dr. Lisa Bourque Bearskin, and Dr. Emily Blanchet-Garneau. We'll also get to hear students and nurses' perspectives from Christina Chakanyuka on the topic of taking responsibility for the history we've all inherited. In Canada, we live and work on the traditional Indigenous territories. We pay our respects to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit ancestors and affirm our commitment to respectful relationships with one another on this land. Here in Montreal, I'm situated on the land of the Mohawks, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nations. I would like to honor the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which I gather today. This webinar will be focused on applying an anti-colonial lens and building capacity to decolonize nursing education. We'll critically reflect on Indigenous knowledge and how we can integrate it to foster transformative learning in anti-racist nursing education. I will now pass it on to our presenters to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first. Hi, I am Amélie Blanchet-Garneau. I'm a white settler of French ancestry, and I live and work on the unceded and stolen lands of the Ghanaian Gehaga Nation. I'm a mother of two, and I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Nursing, Université de Montréal. And my everyday work is to dismantle white supremacy in all the actions that I pose and reflect on. So maybe I'll pass it on to Lisa. You need to unmute yourself, Lisa.
There we go. It wasn't letting me. Thank you. Tansei Tuau. Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Mona Lisa Bourque Bearskin Nasiga son, Amaskwa Sagihigan, Treaty 6 territory. My name is Lisa Bourque Bearskin, and I'm originally from Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Nehewa Osqueo, a Cree woman, mother, nurse, educator, auntie, and I'm coming to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Songhees, Wasanich and Lekwungen people, also known as Victoria. And I'll turn it over to Christina. Oh, before I do, I also want to just acknowledge that both Dr. Wanda Phillips-Beck is unable to join us, and is Michelle Padley, our other colleague, both have come down with the flu and send their regrets. So we'll be covering components of their slide. Over to you, Christina.
Nancy, I'm a Métis nurse and educator and aspiring researcher from a small town in the Northwest Territories called Fort Smith. And the reason we do the land acknowledgement as well as an introduction with critical self-location is that we honor the source of our situatedness, and that the knowledge that we hold stems from who we are as a person and where we come from and to whom we're connected. So myself, on my mother's side, I'm connected to Villebrin and Gladue families, which are Dene and Cree Métis, as well as the Evans family of British descent. And on my dad's side, the MacDonald family, it's a 9th generation settler family. So I'm thankful to be here today. I'm thankful to be a part of this, talking about this really important topic. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. It is good you made it through the night. I know some of the younger people, they used to say that almost sounded morbid, but it is something that our elders had said also. Tomorrow is never promised. So let's make the best of what we have here today. Miss Tessie Luchmet got a Kalmuchen squawks the Kamups the Sukwapnas the Ekwan. Say cookster cook the Sukwapm, cookster cook the Sukwapm Steen, cookster cook the Sukwapm Ulu. Meiti Inuit Chilkutin, Statlium, Captain Silk, Akich, Tanachakan Basket, Sakawam, Irish, Dutch, German, Italian, all nations across this whole world that we are being able to live on. We envision a world where Mother Earth and Indigenous peoples are healthy and vibrant, as well as all people, thinking of human rights as a result of honoring our rights to receive safe, quality Indigenous healthcare and healthcare in general for everyone, education, justice, trades, food sovereignty, where Indigenous communities lead healthy, vibrant lives with every breath, with every prayer, with every stitch, with every nurse, individual, whether you're a teacher, principal, lawyer, judge, or just being a human being, as some people say, good to see you, and they say, it is good to be seen. We think of their legacy of their work. They guide us with their gentle strength, our mentors, our old ones, our grandmothers, grandfathers, as I said, when I said cook stechum cook as cook. Listening to them speak is what brings joy. Their questioning goes to one's core where truth resides. And as we have a moment of silence, we think of all those that have went on, those veterans that have went off to war for us, those that have come back and they have seen no trespassing signs on the land that they had once lived upon and fished in the rivers and went hunting to gather this food. They lost their status because they had signed a paper that they were going to war, thinking that it would make it a better place for our people. Again, I say, we thank your grandmothers and grandfathers. We have a voice. We are not the minority. We are the chosen few, as the Maori elder said over 20 years ago in New Zealand. For now, I say, forever, forever, forever. Ye as jokes.
Hi. Colleen, thanks for starting us off in this good way and reminding us of our ancestors and, where we all come from. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. And thank you, Cousin, for creating this opportunity for us to come together and talk about how do we integrate and how do we address our history in a way that's authentic and meaningful. And so I want to acknowledge my colleague, Wanda Phillips-Beck, who also holds the chair within the Manitoba region. And she unfortunately has come down with COVID and is not well. And so she sends her deep regrets. So I'm going to share a little bit about her work moving forward. And before I get into that, just to remind us again of the context and why we're even here today in terms of Cousin's mission and mandate to really looking at how do we uphold the TRC calls to action, and specifically 24, which challenges us all to think about how do we integrate Indigenous knowledge into our curriculum, and how do we rewrite the wrongs that have happened historically by making invisible the Indigenous nurses and some of our traditional healers and helpers. And as Colleen was talking, Auntie Garlene showed up in the back of her image there on her Zoom link. And, that's, the rich source of our knowledge holders, and Keiteak is a Cree word for old ones. How do we work with our elders and our knowledge holders in a way that is meaningful and respectful of their pedagogy, how they communicate and what they have to share? So it really goes back to the importance of relational practice, again, those key principles around that. And so that's the challenge we all have to move forward on that. And so going back to the beginning is, what does colonization mean? And what does decolonization mean? And how do we apply it? Everyone refers to Yang's article on decolonization as not a metaphor. And, we think about how do we apply these principles of decolonization? It really, again, reiterates those fundamental principles under cultural safety that we talked about in workshop 3, where it really starts with you. And you really have to have a clear understanding about who you are and where you come from. And please feel free to put in the chat your self-location and where you're coming from. It's unfortunate that we don't have the capacity, the space to have a more smaller, intimate conversation, but we really encourage all of you guys here today after this session to go back to your home sites and continue these conversations. And, Christina acknowledged why it was important for us to acknowledge that and to recognize that we're all on stolen lands and unceded territories. And, the importance of how we acknowledge that is piece of our responsibilities as Canadians to acknowledge the wrongs. And that begins with recognizing we are on traditional territories across this country. And so talking a bit about how we even got here and why do we have to now in 2023 really starting to open up these discussions around call it the impact of colonization. I think it's clear it has a syndemic suffering. And Dr. Hart really did a lot of this work and really took a deep dive into elements of colonization and its impact and the power and control. It really means, colonization is that dominating force by a dominant group over another. And so how does that roll out in Canadian nursing context? And I think as healthcare providers, we don't have to look very far to really see those power dynamics at play. And particularly, when we think about nursing itself as a career, we're one of the earliest, youngest professions there is. We had our first PhD program in 1995. So we're the youngest of the sciences when we think about, nursing as a science, as a caring science, as a relational science, and that domination that we function within our system structures. And so to move beyond, it's really starting within yourself, your family, your work sites to really reconceptualize how do we neutralize these conversations about domination, and which knowledge do we privilege, right? That should be one key question we're all asking ourselves is when you're teaching and you're nursing, what literature do you draw on? And how much of that literature is Indigenous literature and authentic place coming from experience and connected to community. And when we think of the history of that forced establishment of the reserve system, the residential school, the Indian hospitals, the fact that we couldn't even enter into nursing careers until 1960 on our own. Prior to that, you needed special permission from the Indian agent from where you were located to even take advanced education. And then when you did, you had to give over your rights as an Indigenous person. And, you know, I think about how degrading that must have been for a lot of our family members and ancestors back, you know, when based on the foundation of Canada. And it even requires us to really question the foundation of our Canadian history. We're founded on stolen lands. So, you know, going back to those original agreements and those original policies and those original documents that were established under the Indian Act still rolls out today in every aspect. And I think that's what Hart's work really talks about, how it's so entrenched in the system in very salient ways that, you know, we often don't even know we're sustaining and maintaining systemic racism because we haven't done the work that we need to do when we look at, you know, nursing overall. And, you know, we're, like I said, we're borrowed knowledge. We're at a time where nursing really needs to do this work for itself. And so moving on to the next slide, you know, as nurses, how do we challenge these systems, right? And what is the impact? We know the impact of colonization is killing our families. That's clear in some of the research that, you know, how harmful the healthcare system is. And then when we look at that, health professionals or people themselves, particularly in, who don't have appropriate access to healthcare, how they internalize this level of racism and oppression that they've remained under for years. And thinking about, and I've already mentioned the exclusion of Indigenous peoples' worldviews in policy development. You know, we talk about them having a voice, but we haven't talked about, you know, what's been the impact for nurses who worked at the Indian hospitals? You know, what's been the impact on the people who were in the residential schools and were forced to all of the experimental procedures, all of the children who never returned home to 15, right? I think about those missed opportunities and the violent impact that colonization still has today. You know, we see the number of children in child welfare. We see the murdered and missing Indigenous women. You know, we see in Winnipeg, you know, we're still advocating for the search of the dumps where there's known to be bodies of women. And, you know, the fact that we have to spend so much advocacy trying to rewrite these wrongs takes an huge amount of energy. And this is where our allies' work is so important, is to start questioning that work, is to start, you know, pushing back on some of these policies and, you know, the poor access and the poor outcomes. You know, we're talking about, you know, when we talk about equity, we really need to start looking at the equity of these outcomes. How many Indigenous nurses and students are in our nursing programs? How many Indigenous faculty are teaching this history? How many partnerships do we have? How have we upheld, you know, UNDRIP? Thinking about some of this work moving forward. And so going on to the next slide is about Wanda Phillips Beck's work. And again, that just reiterates, you know, we know this work. And so this research really coming out is really, you know, putting the power back in the hands of the community leaders and the Indigenous people to help in having a voice to actually fully participate in determining what their healthcare services look like. So her this work is, you know, really mirrors exactly what came out in the report here in British Columbia on the impact of racism. And so how do we apply these actions to support decolonization? And it's creating these spaces for Indigenous healthcare providers, Indigenous healers, Indigenous nurses to come together, Indigenous healthcare providers to really have an opportunity to relook and recognize, how do we incorporate this interdisciplinary approach that is really needed when we look at the gross inequities. And so creating a culture where we're standing up to racism and really in your schools asking about, policy analysis, looking at the policies that drive, say, even admissions to your criteria. Do you have Indigenous faculty on there? Do you have, do you have a process even to account for validating Indigenous identity when we have the questionnaire? How are people validating that people are saying who they are? We know it's a huge issue in Canada right now. And so Philip Beck's really creates the opportunities for Indigenous populations to come together and ask them and frame their own healthcare delivery system. On to the next slide. And so resisting and having those open conversations about challenging your images and what you've thought, it's going to take a lot of unlearning to break down those stereotypes. The main one, is this idea about we get everything for free. It's so ingrained in every aspect of the work that we do, from even outside of healthcare providers. I think about the hotels who house the Indigenous populations when they come from the north, and this sense of whiteness when you go there and you witness Indigenous people being treated as second-class citizens, and not having access to appropriate food for their travel down south. And that lack of support and understanding, and really being able to recognize and question yourself, what is racism? And really moving away from individual racism, thinking and having this normalized conversation about systemic structures, because the system has been built on the myth that this was unfounded land, that Indigenous people don't have rights. It's clearly recognized now, particularly in BC. We see the new legislation starting to come out about reforming even the Health Professions Act, and putting language in there specifically about racism and discrimination. On to the next slide. And so, and even going back to some of our early allies, in McGibbon's work, really focused on nursing and the impact, the role that nursing has had, focusing on cultural competency and transcultural nursing. And all those are really good starting points. But I think it's a progression in history of where nursing is at. And now, transforming our own thinking into looking at, the theory of cultural safety. That's an Indigenous theory, right? That's meaningful to Indigenous people, that we ensure we're talking about safe practice. So shifting away from our ideas about focusing on culture, that's doesn't help us transform from where we need to really sit and unpack our own roles of privilege when we're working in systems such as education, looking at our assignments and how we're reinforcing some of the dominant colonial ideas, right? And some of the assumptions that to be a nurse, you need to have, these high standards of writing. Why aren't we looking at other mechanisms of orality and how that impacts, and the pedagogy of teaching? And so really decolonization really begins individually in our own minds, and decolonizing our own intellectual abilities to even critically think outside the norm. And, Freire's work speaks of this, quite well, about the social leveling of, getting at the heart of the population, and it's around challenging the word and how do we push back for social justice. And so I think, this work is so important for nursing. Moving forward onto the next slide. And so, I kind of given you some theoretical background into terms of, what decolonization means. I think it's clear, the impact that colonization has had on Indigenous people. And so my dear colleague here is also my co-research lead under the BC Research Chair, and we've had the privilege to work alongside of her. And so I think, this is a really good example of that distinct approach we all need to really focus on to avoid the pan-Indianism. Is because I was working in Tecumloops to Shrepmac, it was so important that I develop relationships. And through that really hard work of coming into someone else's territory as a Cree woman, I had the privilege of meeting and learning and working alongside Colleen. And so she has, more of a lived experience that she's going to share now that really wraps up the theoretical aspect to what the foundation of what colonization and decolonization is. Sorry. Over to you, Colleen.
I can't quite hear you yet, Colleen.
They got to unmute her. There we go.
Okay. So that picture that you had seen earlier, even that is a form of decolonization. I'm standing at the backside of the Kamloops Indian Residential School.
Oh, no, that's wrong.
And that is on the boys' side. And could you imagine if I was a little girl back in the day and I was on a boys' side? I even heard stories of my late father and his brother, my Uncle John, going across that line in the dining room because they saw their sister. And maybe just like the ones that had regrets because they have flu now, they cannot be here. But they went over to give their sister a hug and they got reprimanded and told to get back on their other side where they're supposed to be. And after that, my dad said he never got to see his sister again, who was my auntie. And if some of you know the history, they call this area 215 because that's where the little bodies were found. But they changed it to La Esquipue, meaning the missing, because we're looking at it, we have so many numbers. And as I shared before, how many other people have this card that identifies who you are, the 10-digit number that states this is where you're from, this is what family you're from, this is how many children are in your family, or if you go on your own, then what number you are in that family. For example, I was, changed from 06 to 01. But I want to get on and talk about decolonization in my own lived experience. And I think of birth practices, midwifery. One of the most sacred ways was on the land, like a rock basin with holy water meeting holy water from the inside to the earth side. You think of Indian hospitals such as Kokalitsa, where my brother and my dad went for TB. And my brother being there for over a year and being this little guy, and my other brother saying that he never came back the same as when he went. Things like that have to be checked out along with sterilization, but yet there were so many births. What's the meaning behind that? Some were born with no connection to family or culture or community, adopted into the white society, and they're still coming back. And tomorrow we're having a scalia, a sweat lodge, and they want to reconnect. I say allow for our members to be in the dean and directors meetings, making decisions, not to be laughed at, as written in our 1910 Laurier Memorial, where The chiefs were gathered not only from Shawatm Uluch, but from Chilcotin, Tanachuk Basket, Stetlim, and Kepin. And that they were saying, almost like in our coyote stories, like Skupachin, who had all these qualities and characteristics of being strong, noble, speaking the truth, where he was able to go out and do what other people thought impossible. And Coyote laughed at him, saying, how could you let a short-legged, stumpy little creature like him go do such a big job? But then yet we overcome. I say, let us have fun in recruiting and retaining Indigenous students and professors in our institutions or the institutions. Have qualifications that allow them to be in these positions that start with Indigenous, not just someone who works in our community for 6 months and believes that they have all the knowledge to go and run an Indigenous course. That is decolonization. It's not about risks, it's about rights. We used to have protests where we'd have signs and we said Indian rights, then we meant in general, it means human rights. Let us work together to make the necessary policy and procedural changes. Look at our own racism and biases and how we perceive people. That is decolonization. Research, such as stem cell research. Let us not promote indoctrination. Allow people to be critical thinkers. Uplift the oppressed, because oppressors equals violence. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And we understand this. This is decolonization. Our people being greeted at the door, being seated at our healthcare center with the doctor asking if we'd like something to drink or eat. It takes a lot to walk through those doors for some people. Their eyes, they see things, their nose smells things, their senses, they feel. But then they get this authority figure that they might look at, the coldness, the sterile feel of the place, the ridicule that they may have experienced, but somebody coming and greeting them that way at the door, that is decolonization. Doctors and residents and working together, coming down the hallway to meet you, address you by name and the purpose of your appointment, and then they ask any other questions. That is decolonization. Seeing that all the instruments and the tools that are required for the appointment are laid out, and they go over it with you in their presence, knowing that you're there and that you can see what they're going to do, and they ask you if you would rather use this or do it this way, and you are given options, and you are actually a part of the whole procedure. Your input matters, rather than just saying, here's a gown, put it on, we'll be back in a moment. Instead, they see you as human and that you have rights. That is decolonization. As a mentor shared in a spiritual ceremony, sacred, not secret. If you're feeling discomfort in any way, it is your conscience. You know you are in a safe place. And as another old one spoke, be proud, use your voice. It is a gift. Speak loud, don't whisper. If you make a mistake, no one will laugh. No one will laugh at you. That is decolonization. Remember, that is how we all learn. You are in a safe space for Tkalkukbi's sake or God's sake. Don't just use a clipboard with 14 pages to fill out, giving it to someone who goes in there and you don't even realize that some people might not know the basic westernized reading and writing. They might not have the knowledge to be able to do this on their own. They might have some dis-ease, such as Parkinson's. They might not know how to advocate for themselves, and then meanwhile, you decide to go over all the same questions orally now. Then into the doctor's office, and now he or she flips through the same sheets on the clipboard, asks you the same questions. Or you might have the great good fortune to be in the presence of a doctor who says, "What is your name? Do you remember why you're here?" And asking it in such a manner that we're on the same page together. Placing that clipboard onto the side and then rolling his chair from behind the desk to be right in front of you. And it's like a dyad and you have eye contact and getting spoken to. And he questions, "Do you have any questions or concerns?" That is decolonization. And then I remember saying, "Yes, I'd like the traditional to meet the Western. For my surgery, I'd like to use my own protection medicine." And he rolled his chair even closer. "May you tell me about it?" he asked. And I did. I felt safe. I felt that he would listen. He said, "I'll make a note of it." And right away, he went behind his desk and he made a note on his computer. I asked, "And where can I use it?" And he answered, "Not around the nose or the mouth, but anywhere else, because around the nose and the mouth is where the mask will go on you." And I said, "Okay, that is decolonization." I picked up the surgical sponge, remembered what we spoke of. Then I received the call from his office. A young woman goes over the date, time, place, and surgery, then starts to discuss about the surgical sponge and starts to explain about the note of traditional medicine and how I was to apply it. And because I have a voice, I said, "Whoa, hey, hold on now. These are teachings from my parents, and they got them from their grandparents. And how far down the line did those teachings come from?" And then she says, "Oh, excuse me, I apologize, I'm sorry." That is decolonization. I'm in surgery at another time and the doctor gets pricked or poked and people leave the room, but there's a young woman who starts asking me questions about the last time I had drugs or alcohol and hepatitis. And I'm like, "What?" And then I see a doctor briskly walking down the hall and he has this presence about him. He asks everyone to leave the room. My buddy, she comes in with me. He states what had happened and asks if I would volunteer to come down and do lab or blood work. And I say, yes. He walks me and my buddy down to the emergency room and states to a young woman, "This is Miss Colleen Seymour. This is the blood work that's required." That is decolonization. However, though, when he leaves, I'm left sitting in this emergency room that looks so dirty and old and nothing like what is written in the book of nursing reflections, a century of caring, cleaning, fumigation, ventilation. My advocate asked these nurses about 3 times about the lab work, even that we could go to the lab area. I'm sure my buddy in her background, her history, could have easily taken my blood. She could have used the tape on the vial with necessary information, knowing where it came from and who took it and what date it is and even what time. I had the time to give a piece of my artwork because I had been in that same emergency room a few months earlier, and thanking the nurses, the doctors, the firemen who came, the ones who drove the ambulance, the police. I went to all those places to give them this artwork that said, "Thank you." And I went to the head nurse and they told me where to stand. And she said, "I'll be with you in a minute." And sure enough, she started coming. But just by that time, another lady had come along and asked me, "Can you move? You're in the way." And then the other nurse, the head nurse, spoke up. And she was my advocate at that time. That is decolonization. Next time, my buddy says, "We're going to leave. You volunteered. And then it seemed like then they heard. Then I got my blood work done. So just like today's meeting, when we start our meetings, we have a spirit plate. We have water, we have medicine from the land. And if a fire is built, we feed the fire. Or I ask people to offer to the land or water. We do a check-in. And prior to the meeting, the individuals share how they feel connected, authentic, being in a safe space where they take accountability to gather strength, serenity, and support. We are given context, so we do not take anything personally. It is powerful, intergenerational kinship relations. Being in the company of our giants, our elders, our old ones, who some people may say we call them our mentors, when we may feel feeble, vulnerable, or weak, or have self-doubt, we know we can stand tall, proud, and fulfill our purpose upon this earth. We have the perspective and the opportunity to transform, heal. Our Indian doctors, our healers, our helpers, our health professionals, we're able to use water as medicine. Use an animal horn to suck out clotted blood or something that was not supposed to be in your body. Offer it back to the water, to the land, or to the fire. We could lie in the arms of an old man, one we called Grandpa, and be healed. Just his presence was that powerful. We could say our words to Kalkukbi, our creator, God, whatever you may address this being as, and be cured. We could feel the fans of birds or rattles go over our body and see rainbow-colored orbs going so quickly around the room as we heard drumming and singing in the words of our people. Our wise ones guide and guard us as they bind us together like the wet sinew on a wooden frame. Sinew from those that gave their life, like the moose, the elk, the deer, even the buffalo or others. Life experiences bring forth that silver lining. Our matriarchs have shared that with us, those teachings. That is decolonization. As an old man shared, our scalia, our sweat lodge was and is our church, home, hospital, and school. And as he would say, believe. That is decolonization. The rocks, as our people, some say our grandfathers, our grandmothers, and some say the structure represents the womb. And we say, come sit with me upon the land. Let us be together. Welcome to my safe space. One of them that I go pray in one of the ceremonies, that is decolonization. And when you come with us, that is another form of decolonization. You took the initiative to be welcomed and to take the word that you would be in a safe space. Let us listen to the old ones when they speak. It is true love, rolling like waves across their lips to our ears and our hearts. We listen. That is decolonization. As an institution now calls these mentors, can you please use the word preceptors? But where did they get that idea from? Why aren't they able to share that it came from our own people? But because they want to take that knowledge, and that's what our people are so afraid of, that the knowledges that we use in some of these dissertations, the theses that are written out there, they don't want to share it with institutions because they figure it will be used in the wrong way, that others will take ownership of it. And meanwhile, it's the words from generations back. At least recognize those ideas that came from our people. Recognize that it is our people that have shared these teachings with you. You have the opportunity to make a positive choice. That is decolonization. And as you saw my auntie in the background, and she got it from one of our people, and as he told a story, he said, this is like deja vu. I was told that I was to walk down this path. But now that path has changed because they have done clear-cut logging. Now that path has changed because they have dammed the rivers. It is not as it was before, but our stories are so clear and laid out that we can remember them. And as he'd say, let us descend. Let us be the best of the best. And that is decolonization. Maois, forever, forever, forever. Ye as jokes. Finish.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for sharing all those teaching with us today. I feel very, very honored to have been here and listening to you for those minutes that you shared your experiences and stories with us. And I think that one thing that I noted when you were talking, it's not about risk, it's about rights. And it really resonated into what I'm doing as a work. And I think that it's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about decolonization, because decolonization is about, well, the status quo is not acceptable, and it's all about rights, right? So the rights for self-determination, and I think it's really should be at the center of our thoughts, and not, you know, oh, we can't do this because it's too risky, or we're going to change the whole structure and it's not going to work, or, you know, we think of those barriers and everything, but at the end, if we think it's about rights, no barriers are meant to be or meant to exist. So we want to lead you to our first Menti questions. And so if you follow the instructions here and you can either use the QR code or go to the website and enter the code and answer the question, and we're going to share what you will share with us. So the question is, what can you do in the School of Nursing to address colonization? We also have some resources shared in the chat as well as we speak, if you want to have a look at it. Or Lisa, would you like to say something while we are looking at the answers? I think somebody needs to unmute. Lisa.
I don't know why that's so weird, but I just wanted to, that was the work of Wanda's that I put in the chat there. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. There's a lot of answers about reflection, but I can also see a lot of answers about action, and decolonization is really about action. So it's really very, very important that we reflect and we listen, but it's also very, very important that we act. So I can see that there are many strategies that we can use here. Invite knowledge keepers, listen, be open to other ways of knowing, and maybe integrating other ways of knowing in our classes, in our ways of doing at the Faculty of Nursing, collaboration.
Those are great, Emily. I just wanted to two things that I was thinking of that's really, really important that we all need to give serious and very thoughtful how we do it is the integration of our community leaders, our knowledge holders, because it's not just a matter of inviting them in. We need to move beyond inviting them in to start us off in a good way. They need to be participatory all the way through from the question. We even need to move away from advisory at a very national level. Even our research grants we're looking at now, they must be Indigenous led. So that is a key message. Decolonization is nothing about us without us. And so that means that our allies need to create this space for the Indigenous leadership, the nurses, the community leaders, the old ones to do this. And we got to do it in a good way where they're safe and they're compensated in a way that measures and equally what we receive in academia. So I just want to say that's where we're at right now, is really thinking clearly about how we create those partnerships. But some great comments. I agree, action.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. It's all, and this is what I'm coming to as well. It's not only about what we teach or what we do as action, but really how we do it, and how to do it in a good way, we need to do it together. So I'm gonna continue on that. Yes, so it's me. We all know me by now, no? So you've probably heard through those workshops, and early on, Lisa also shared that with us, that you know, in nursing education, health professionals education, we are still using a lot of multiculturalist lens to talk about racism and discrimination. However, when we look at multiculturalism, it has a lot of limits, and it's not so far, it's not as been a powerful tool to talk about broader racist discourses that are embedded in organizational policies, structures, and cultures. So many commissions, such as the TRC Commission and associations in Canada, are recommending adopting anti-racist pedagogical approaches to integrating Indigenous history, knowledge, and issues into their curriculum. So we really need to focus on adopting a more anti-racist lens and perspective in education. So it's not only about what we're teaching in classes, but also how we do it. And I just want to remind you that anti-racism goes way beyond classes. It involves questioning the way we're doing things, you know, at the structural level. So how do we organize care, but also how do we organize our curriculum, and what are students exposed to, and how do we build those relationships with Indigenous communities, knowledge keepers, and elders, to make sure that we do things in a good way in our programs. So basic key principles of anti-racism education is really to foster transformative learning to counteract the effects of racism and discrimination. And it means to question structural conditions and power dynamics, take action, grounded in contextualized knowledge. That means that what's happening in Quebec may not be working in BC, may not be working in Manitoba. So we all need to connect with local communities and make sure that we are responding to what's happening in our own context. It's also a praxis-oriented critical consciousness. So we saw earlier a lot of things that were related to reflection, listening. So this is a very important part of anti-racism work as well, to make sure that we are, that those reflections are leading to actions that do not cause harm. So I wanted to share with you today the results of the scoping review that we did earlier this year. So we wanted to see how people teach about how they implement anti-racist educational interventions in the curriculum, and what are the impacts of those interventions. So we wanted to see how people are measuring the impacts, and what kind of impacts are happening, you know, in health professionals education. So from those 38 studies, there were a variety of interventions, courses, curricula, whole trainings, both in initial and continuing education, workshops, lectures, and a discussion, a retreat, a video, and an event that was involving many different smaller interventions. So what was measured? So we used Kirkpatrick levels of evaluation to classify what was measured in those interventions. So I just want to explain to you what are those 4 levels, and keep in mind that there's a question following that for you. So listen to what are those 4 categories. So reaction is really about evaluating the training and not really the students. So we are looking at the students' reaction and thoughts about the training experience. We want their opinions on their learning experience. So the typical questions concerns the degree to which the experience was valuable, whether they felt engaged, whether they felt the training was relevant. When we measure learning, it's the students' resulting learning from taking the training or the course. So it should increase knowledge, attitude, skills, confidence, and motivation from the training experience. It is more oftenly measured as a self-report or sometimes measured externally, so like pre-post or only post surveys. When we measure behavior, we are looking at the students' behavioral changes and improvement after applying the skills in their actual practice. So we want to measure the degree to which the participants' behavior has changed as a result of the training. So this needs to be a pre and a post measurement survey. And when we look at the results, so this is something that is not measured very often. So the results are the effect that the student's performance has on the organization. So it's going beyond the learner, beyond the person who was sitting in the class. So we want to look at tangible results such as reduced cost, improved quality and efficiency, increased productivity, employee retention, increased sales, higher morale, and it can also determine the critical return on investment of the training expenditures. So it's a really a business-like measure to see if the training was really providing the change and impacts at the organizational levels that we wanted it to have. So it also requires both a pre and post event measurement of the training objective. So I would be interested to see here if you have measured something when you're using educational strategies. What have you measured? At which level from what you've heard about those levels? So I just want to remind you, so reaction is really about evaluating the training itself. Learning is really about the knowledge, skills, attitudes that are changing after the training, and the level of confidence is also part of this. Behavior is really how students have changed the way they act, how they implement this in their practice, and results is beyond the person who was sitting in the class. You can choose the higher level you assessed, I would say. What we see so far kind of reflects the tendency of what we see in the literature. So you can continue to fill in this survey because it's really interesting to see what's happening here among the participants. And you can see that it's also reflecting what's happening in the literature that we reviewed. So most papers talked about the evaluation of reaction and learning. Very few of them assessed the results. So there's a very interesting question coming to this. So how are we accountable to the, the strategies that we're using in our programs if we don't measure larger impacts? And how can we measure them? It's not a simple challenge. It is quite the challenge to measure the results, but it may be something to think about and something to aim for if we want to be accountable. And if we want to say that, if we don't want to just, check the box saying, oh, all our students are trained for Indigenous history. Well, if we're not measuring behavior change, how can we say that? So before we check that boxes, I invited all of us, including me, to make sure that we are really measuring what's happening after the training, or, what are the real impacts of what we're teaching in class and how we're doing it as well. Because now we're only talking about, how we measure things from the student's perspective, what they've learned and everything, but also we should also look at how we did things in the training, and did we do it in a good way or not. And I think that today you could easily, take out some recommendation from that workshop saying, oh, this is how we should do things in our school. We should invite knowledge keepers and elders not only to participate in an advocacy, or not advocacy, in the as a consultation way, but really involve them in decisions and the way that we're doing things. So what we learned from that review is that, there are promising strategies to foster engagement and motivation to transform practices, but those are the only things we can recommend after looking at the literature, because nothing was measured beyond engagement and motivation to transform practices. So the most recurrent themes covered by the papers of this review is really creating the safe space. And it's important because it helps participants to take risk and nurture authentic engagement. It seemed to foster open dialogue, allowing participants to further explore their thoughts and feelings and perspectives in a meaningful and non-judgmental way. And this was quite as important, given that racism, oppression, and privilege can be difficult to tackle, namely because of the emotional response that it might trigger. But even the notion of safe space was not clearly defined in the article selected for this review. So some authors did describe some of its traits, which can help us to grasp, its definition. So it's a place where everybody will learn from each other's teaching. So it includes the educators, right? There were very clear ground rules before each sessions that were named to make sure that the communication was respectful. It also gave participants the option of opting out should they didn't feel at ease or feel safe. So it was really important for the participants to feel comfortable. And the educators reminded attendees to disclose only what they were comfortable sharing as well. So to overcome one of the challenge of creating a safe space, which is to have to gain participants' trust, some sessions were led by participants themselves, rather than by experts, faculty, and everything. But we all need to be very careful when we mean to create a safe space, to make sure that we are not assuming that everybody feels safe in that space as well. As you know, collaborative activities as well are very good ways to make unfamiliar concepts more familiar, and also sharing lived experience also being very careful on how we do that and how we also deal with the emotional response that it may involve as well. So all that to say that we need to have also a lot of training for educators around anti-racism education to make sure that those spaces are handled safely and in a good way as well. What was really surprising, and this is the final thoughts around that review, is that although we were talking about anti-racism and anti-racist education, only a few of the authors share the positionality statement. So you probably saw that all of our workshops are starting in that way. So we are locating ourselves on the land, but we are also locating ourselves in the work that we're doing. So it's really important because it changes the way that we see and understand anti-racism. So that was quite surprising to see that not more of the authors were doing a positionality statement. And also there were no critical theoretical frameworks used to guide the evaluation. So they use kind of a mainstream evaluation guidelines to assess critical knowledge. So that's also a surprise that is interesting. So it's not really congruent with anti-racism. So there is still a lot of work to do to make sure that we are doing things in a good way. But I hope that there are a few examples or principles that you can grasp from this workshop today. Up to you, Lisa. You still need to be on mute. Thank you.
It doesn't allow me to unmute, but thank you very much for that, that important work to showcase where we really have some gaps. And when I mentioned earlier about equity, looking at the equity of outcomes, you know, that what you did there really supports that. We're not looking at the outcomes, right? So thank you, Emily, for that work and really sharing the, you know, that the foundation of the criticality that we need to have. And so I'm going to just take us back a little bit, a step back, because based on those three key principles that you talked about lived experience, about rights, and about collaboration, and to give voice and space for, you know, as a graduate student coming from community, a very strong community perspective, from my own lived experience of trauma and violence as a result of the colonial system, navigating graduate education was almost impossible. But I will say it was, you know, the tenacity we have from the survival of the trauma. I never accepted no. And I demanded, you know, and some people, you know, think that's passion. People think that's, you know, anger. But I created for myself an opportunity to create a learning journey that I really had to push nursing thinkers outside the box. And the big one is around my PhD, Mamaweo Kamatawin, you know, working together to help each other. And so situating this work was so important for me as a graduate student. I didn't want to just study, you know, disease and alcoholism and violence, which is what the recommendations were, grounded theory, because it didn't have meaning to me. And so the work that I journeyed on, I prayed, I did all of our cultural things. I went back to my family, which was the most important piece of this work. And I was able to, you know, get the emotional support from family and friends to do the deep unpacking we need to do as Indigenous people, reconciling and I say consiling our own, we have all our own business. I am the only one as Indigenous that can deal with my trauma and my disdain over structures and systems that continue to force and silence and erase Indigenous peoples from this country. And so Where I had success was very strategic, is finding my allies. Dr. Brenda Cameron, who is a phenomenologist, saw something important in this as her responsibility as an educator to create space for that opportunity. Dr. Malcolm King was strategic. He was outside of nursing. He was male, and he was also a leader. And so he was a strategic choice. And then I need to also ground this work in anything I did around integrating indigeneity into my work was Dr. Cora Weber-Pelwax, one of the first Indigenous Métis women in the country to hold a faculty position. So with that, I reached out to my, I call it community. They weren't even my community. I reached out broadly to the Indigenous nursing community. And I had this opportunity to develop partnerships and relationships with these 4 key individuals. And so I just want to just use this example through my PhD journey as a way to help colleagues see how important it is to create this space for scholars to use Indigenous research methodologies. So on to the next slide. And I think that was the biggest challenge. Nursing did not see Indigenous research methodologies as an appropriate framework to use. They didn't even think it was the research framework. And so, that's one of the benefits of the literature and the science world is, the work of our Indigenous scholars. And so we look to our global family and Dr. Tawani Smith, as all of us people, regardless of culture, is, this human curiosity. We have a responsibility to each and every one of us is to nurture that. And so I found through a few individuals space where I could nurture that. And so I engaged and rooted all of my work in my own healing and my connection to my mother and my grandmother, who I was separated from, and yet I witnessed the horrific treatment they received. And as a young child, I could just never make sense of that. And I just, why, the question I was always lingering is, why did they hate us so much? Why couldn't they hold my mom's hand? Why couldn't they look at me as a young, child, needing comfort, needing protection? And so hence this PhD work was so important for my own growth, but also my contribution to nursing. And again, so moving forward quickly on to, so just the nutshell of this is these, my partners and my women really set the foundation, and they went on this lifelong journey with me. And, even though I'm done the PhD, they're still involved in every aspect of my work, including the chair. And I've extended now to bigger. And so the key messages of, this work really is fourfold, right? And working along Leah Bill, I really began to think deeply about, this consciousness of spiritual self and how that's integrated into our nursing practice. And then, with Alice Reed, a nurse practitioner, she had to go outside our country to become a nurse practitioner. She got all her credentials and she came back and she couldn't work as a nurse practitioner. So again, our policies in nursing sometimes do us such disservice. And you'll see there Madeline and Evelyn, and they continue to be, Canadians call, the famous 5. I always call these my famous 5. These are our Indigenous famous 5 in nursing. And so on to the next slide. So this just gives you a quick glimpse into these ideas and notions of, how we're connected to ourself. You see, again, it starts with self. It's about our family. It's about the greater part of society. And how, do we take up these rights-based discussions to focus on our strengths, on what we contribute as Indigenous people through our language. And if we're erasing language, and if we're not even including language in our curriculum anywheres, how do we ever find hope in a future for our future generations to ever move forward? Because we know culture lies in the language. It is the year of the language. And I don't think I see any, You know, I still hear PhD students struggling to get language into their PhDs. So moving on to the next slide. You know, and again, these are key messages, right? This is, you know, going back to the land. This is the Inuit, right? And so being inclusive, right? It's coming from the shared lived experience, and not negating traditional health, but helping us support the conversation, not to ask what's in that traditional medicine, but even just asking a patient, you know, what are you using, right? You know, it's even how you ask the question. They'll know right away whether or not, you know, not that they can use it or not use it, but what are you using? Do you want to use it? Have you used it, right? And so being that really important. And again, we've talked about this apprenticeship, intergenerational. I call it apprenticeship because in my traditional practice, that's what we do. So on to the next slide. And so I just wanted to give you a real snippet into what I'd learned. And it really enforces what needs to happen in Canada when we look at these 4 domains of practice. And when we look at Indigenous health service delivery, you know, we have to come to truths that this Canadian government, our Canadian healthcare system is founded on the medicine chest clause. That is the first health policy in this country that's been recognized, established, you know, back in 1867, and it's still implemented today in 2013. So I need people to think about that. And, you know, we say and talk about how hurtful it is. And, you know, how do we uphold and how do we sustain that Indian Act in our everyday actions? And it's about power and it's about hegemony. And how do you deconstruct and move those barriers from a hegemony of power? I'm in a decision making to a collective space where we can do that. And so through this work, I was able to learn so many amazing things, and I was able to come to a healing journey for myself and reconcile the harm that I put. Move on to the next slide. And what we embody, we talk about that embodiment and that responsibility we have to our students, to our patients. And so it is about equity of outcomes. It's about let's normalize this conversation about Indigenous health in this country, right? If we don't have our Indigenous people there to help us, how are we ever going to make authentic change? We need positions. We need space. We need to be able just to speak to that being in nursing. On to the next slide. And so I won't go into this. You know, people should be looking at all their own local strategic plans, you know, their nursing ethics, all of these aspects of accountability, responsibility, reciprocity. You know, we know the benefit as an Indigenous researcher for me doing this work. I get published, I get a job, but what's the benefit for my colleague, Colleen, who doesn't have an academic position, who I have to pay in honorariums because that's the only policy we have in place to be able to support that rich knowledge set. And so why do the Indigenous colleagues always have to come up and push against these colonial walls? You know, we're fighting hard for rights. And, you know, and one of my research projects talks about, you know, from our clusters research about being like water. And that's what it is. It's, you know, we're always having to take another turn, find another door, find another path. And I think we need to do better at this time in this country, that this is rights-based, this is a distinction-based, and we have the medicine chest clause to really outline that's the foundation of which our Canadian healthcare was established. So please take a look at that medicine chest clause and think about how you're applying those principles. And on to the next slide. So yes, so that was so yeah, so just a little bit of snippets about that. So when I did all of that work as a graduate study, then I tried to come and naively just implement it in academia in my teaching roles. And although we've made significant steps, it hasn't gone without challenge. So you know, I think about this question all the time as, you know, faculty members and other faculty members at schools of nursing that we're tasked with integrating this history. And so, you know, my question to other people is, you know, where do you start, right? What would you include? And I hope we've provided you some glimpse into that. You know, again, just reiterating, you know, re-looking at our doctrine of discovery, re-looking at, you know, Emily alluded to multiculturalism and our neoliberal ideologies. We have a huge, strong nursing cohort here in British Columbia that are, you know, really pushing back on these neoliberal ideologies and really bringing forth very fruitful conversations, which is such important work. And that gives me as an Indigenous scholar the space that I need to do to create space for other Indigenous students to be able to come to a space where we can engage with Indigenous literature, to really, you know, get away from all the systemic racism, because it's when you have that shared lived experience, it gives us life to think differently, to think for ourselves, that freedom of the colonial mind. And so returning back to our local lands, you know, ensuring that you're always informed and you're working from a position of laws in their local languages. Make sure that you understand the importance of treaties and which treaties you are on and what land claims here are important to the work. And, you know, always leveraging self-determination and sovereignty and creating space and safety for our 60 scoop people, for our residential school survivors, for, you know, the women that were sterilized, that are still being sterilized, you know, the Murdered and Missing Women campaign. I could go on on all the causes. We don't need no more evidence. We just need action, and we need it now, and we need it yesterday. And on to the next slide. Oh, so my question. And again, so speaking to UNDRIP, right? In BC, there's a lot of movement with legislation on UNDRIP and how do we uphold? And so, you know, I encourage you guys all to think, you know, what are those articles? How are you including them into your everyday practice as a nurse? And so I'm good to see, and, you know, and the honesty right there, not familiar, you know, as an Indigenous scholar, that surprises me because I function from a place where everybody knows about it, right? But, and again, that just, you know, when you're not in that environment, that worldview, you don't know what you don't know. And so there's still so much I don't know that I'm learning, right? That fits with what my allies don't know. And I just encourage us to really enter into this phase of it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay not to know, but it's not okay to not act and to find resolution. And we have to create some kind of common ground. And there's always solutions moving forward. So the Indian Act, very familiar. Good, not familiar. Yeah. And, you know, one of the biggest things on that is the medicine chest clause, right? That is our inherent right as Indigenous people to access healthcare. When I think of the experience I just had with my own family coming from the North, accessing healthcare services, I just was appalled. I was so appalled at their experience. And it was such a good reminder how far removed I am the further I go into academia from the lived experiences in how that racism is internalized in families and the bodies. And I actually needed a week off for my family leave because of the racism we faced during that whole adventure. And so I'm glad to see, yes, there's the medicine chest clause, you know, and right now there's always been a big, huge interpretation of that. The government thinks that it's, you know, it's a nice thing they're doing by providing this medicine chest clause, but they're not coming it from it as a rights-based and accountability. It's more a fiduciary responsibility. And that's really important to understand that language, that government language. Like, what does fiduciary responsibility mean when we have an ethical and moral responsibility outlined in our nursing code of ethics that actually contravenes the work we have to do, the non-insured health benefits. So Indian hospitals, right? Like that truth is just starting to be uncovered. People are just starting to talk about themselves as working in these sites and being held accountable to those sites, right? You know, the segregated healthcare, that just happened in Saskatchewan, where they use the identity number R to every Indigenous person. And I just thought, whoa, that, I know that might have been well intended, but how it was taken up and perpetuated was sustaining systemic racism. I think they've done away with that now, but I can't specifically speak to that. So that's good. And I'm mindful that I want to give Christina time now to talk about some of the good things. The forced Dr. Boyer in the Senate right there, right now. She's, amazing advocacy she's done around bringing that to the attention. But again, you see those leaderships. In those leaderships, that's where the impact is happening. If we don't have good leaders to really push the bar and stay true to what we said we were going to, the only reason we're having this impact is we have that, we're having the right leadership really move forward in some of this work. So that's really good to see. And then Indigenous nursing organizations. I'm curious to see what the response here is. And this is something I think we should be celebrating. It was the first, it was an Indigenous nurse that ever held a policy position that it was advisory to the Ministry of Health. And that started the origin of our Indigenous Nursing Professional Association back in 1975, a group of 12 women, great advocacies, our matriarchs, our Indigenous mothers that, said, no, this is not okay. And the fact that, we haven't really celebrated that more surprised me. And when I think of the leadership provided by that organization, we were the first ones to also include LPNs in our family. We revised our policies, and now we've seen that impact happen at the Canadian Nurses Association, at other organizations where they're allowing us nurses to be one big family. And so I will turn it over to Christina now.
Hello, everyone. Wow, Lisa, I have a quick question before I get into this, because I'm furthering my own learning by just asking now, when you say the letter R was used, was that for red?
I don't know what it was. It was to designate, yeah. I'd have to dig or talk to somebody
We'll find out. Yeah, I'm going to look into that for my own learning. As it just baffles me how much we don't know. And with such a push in the last series, we covered cultural safety and really shifting safety to the focus, and culture as, that's a strength. Culture is a strength. The safety piece, that is taking responsibility for the history that we've all inherited. At the University of Victoria, there's a course, Nursing 484, and it's sort of our response to truth and reconciliation, call to action number 24, where entering into a relational space uses Indigenous pedagogy such as circle, storytelling, self-reflection, and experiential learning methods as well, to engage a critical social lens, exploring power, white privilege, racism, and culture. The impact of colonization on Indigenous health, rather than focusing on alcoholism, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and so many other things that actually can be reevaluated from a trauma-informed lens, to problematize the impact of systemic racism, the ongoing impact of systemic racism, and learning about the history. And so those things on that last couple slides there, don't know why that went off, but on the last couple slides, oh, thank you very much, Safina. Registered Indian, possibly, in Saskatchewan. So embedded in the course, aside from having critical self-location is something that the students do, and that I would invite all nursing faculty to do, because we can't focus on this work just being towards students for the truth and reconciliation calls to action. The faculty and nurses out in practice really need to engage at a much more action-oriented and just a critical way to really make it about ourself, first of all. Embedded in this particular course is also strengths and gifts of Indigenous knowledge and teachings. My colleague Leanne Poitras Kelly has a framework that she's developing that really refers the students towards reclaiming and ourselves to reclaiming our relationship with ourselves, with our history, with our ancestry, with Indigenous peoples in Canada, decolonizing our knowledge, and then also what are our obligations moving forward. So there's that action-orientedness that is really built into this framework that, that Leanne's been developing. Next slide. At Thompson Rivers University, 6300, Indigenous Health Leadership, similarly was developed by Indigenous nurse leaders and really focuses on students having the opportunity to develop knowledge of Indigenous people's history, traditional perspectives, health wellness practices, and challenges inherent in the complex and interrelated sociocultural, historical, and contextual dimensions and determinants of health. So beyond the original social determinants of health that we have in our introductory classes in nursing education, we can look at and analyze how is colonization a determinant of health? How is racism a determinant of health that is specific to Indigenous populations? And what are we going to do about it? Next slide. So here we have our team brought together by Dr. Lisa Bourque Bearskin with knowledge holder Colleen Seymour, my friend Michelle Padley, working together towards the chair intentions as designed by Lisa. But here's the thing, it's not actually, as Lisa would say, the Lisa show or anything like this. This work is informed by the grandmothers. Those same grandmothers that Lisa was presenting about earlier have informed every single thread that is woven into this beautiful framework, or rather tapestry, for advancing Indigenous wellness by reconciling parallel pathways in Indigenous health nursing, innovating wise practices for education, standards, partnerships, and research. Next slide. So here we are building on a legacy. Edith Montour was the first Indigenous nurse in Canada. She had to go to the United States to train as well. And in 1914, she was the first Indigenous nurse to practice in Canada. And out in the West Coast here, we also honor and recognize Rose Casper, who was the first Indigenous nurse out on this sort of in Western Canada area, and many more in her generation that were just coming and were often the lonely only. A little bit of background for our history. In 1971, the International Council of Nurses designated May 12th as International Nurses Day on the birthday of Florence Nightingale, who lived from 1820 to 1910. Then in 1985, the Canadian Nurses Association proclaimed the week of May 12th as National Nurses Week. In 2022, National Nursing Week celebrations took place and honored the theme of We Answer the Call, and really highlighting Florence Nightingale's birthday to showcase courage, commitment, and many roles that nurses have played, especially in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, in the 2020 year of the nurse and midwife, a statement was made actually, though, that called into question why we are celebrating and honoring so much so the New Zealand Nurses Organization. A statement said, "The historical figures whom we choose to venerate say a lot about who we are," and became the first national nursing organization to publicly choose not to celebrate Florence Nightingale due to a painful history and legacy of colonial caring and violence and trauma, taking responsibility for the history that we've all inherited. At the height of the British Empire and colonizing healthcare, Nightingale actually did have an active role in solidifying paternalistic attitudes of Eurocentric superiority in nursing. So when we look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the 94 Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and the 24 recommendations in the BC In Plain Sight report, they acknowledge the vital importance of Indigenous healthcare providers as champions of sustainable Indigenous sovereignty in health and well-being. And so in light of recent efforts to dismantle harmful colonial legacies and increase calls for Indigenous specific cultural safety and anti-racism in the Canadian healthcare system, many Indigenous nurses have been calling for April 10th to be designated as Indigenous Nurses Day in honor of Edith Anderson Montour, who lived from 1890 to 1996. And so really the invitation stands. We're continuing this celebration in 2024, April 10th in BC. There will be some events, but really, as there's so many people across the nation that are on this call, we'd invite everyone to celebrate Indigenous nurses and the contributions made. Next slide. Here we have a framework that really is informed by Indigenous nursing grandmothers, aunties, and the ongoing work of nurses that are in practice. This was put together by Dr. Lisa Bourque Bearskin for the BC Indigenous Health Nursing Research Chair Program, and as one of 6 Indigenous health nursing research chairs from across Canada. Next slide. And building on that legacy from Edith Anderson Montour to Alice Reed and Rose Casper and so many other Indigenous nurse champions and leaders, we have intergenerational mentorship and experiential research built into the program here. And just to highlight, Nikki Rose Hunter Porter, who finished her Master's of Nursing with a focus on exploring experiences of First Nations mental wellness services with the Porcupine. Michelle Padley, who finished her Master of Nursing with holistic promotion of youth wellness from a Métis perspective, the spirit of knowledge sharing with Métis Kihitayak in BC. And with Victoria Dick, who is now one of the students in the Indigenous Graduate Education and Nursing, Master of Nursing, Indigenous focus. And really, we can go to the next slide. That's where I'll pass back to Lisa to share a bit about this really exciting first ever initiative for reclaiming and recovering Indigenous knowledge in graduate education.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you for that overview. I think, this is just the projection in the history of kind of what we've been able to do, where we landed our last CIHR grant was really to look at developing this collaborative Indigenous graduate program. Next slide, that, really was about recognizing that each of our institution has limited capacity. And so how do we share that so we can grow stronger. So we reached out to other sites. So we've created this collaborative approach to Indigenous health nursing at a graduate level, and we're in the midst of co-designing and co-working. The key is really highlighting distinction-based, going back to those home fires. So example, UVic is working with its local nation here to help that knowledge translation about incorporating and partnering with local Indigenous communities. UBCO Vancouver is doing the same work. They've got their home fire and their elders and their knowledge holders and their Indigenous nurses experts. And so we're trying to create this collaborative framework to offer, and I must say, on to the next slide, it's been so exciting to be part of that. When we launched it, it became a research, and we have 20, currently we have, we started with 25 applications. We have 17 and who are just starving and just, you know, craving for this opportunity to think Indigenous without all of the noise around racism and discrimination, because it's so inherent in everything, and it's systemic. It's not, you know, so just, it's so important for us to just now turn it over to Emily to kind of just capture some of our key takeaways. You know, that
Yes, when we talked about addressing Indigenous specific racism, I just want us to think that it concerns everyone. Even though you are walking by Indigenous people or not in your daily activities, it concerns you anyway. And it's also about shifting the organizational structure, culture and structure and to proactively address Indigenous specific racism. You know, it's not going to end by itself with good intentions. It needs action. So it's also about being a doer for change, and being a careful doer, I must say, and work with Indigenous people to do that, and aim for transformative learning, because, you know, status quo is not an option.
Thank you. And again, I think it really speaks to the accountability piece. How do we be accountable, right? And so systems and structures could really look at you know, taking that accountability. Even though we weren't directly responsible, we are indirectly responsible. And, you know, we need to acknowledge that. And so you already spoke about the behaviors, you know, really nurturing this conversation away from culture to about safety, and how do we create, and recognizing safety is hard to come by. And so really, you know, the training, there's lots of opportunities for training. And I think that's on to the next slide. I want to give time. Yes, so BC here has got these new guidelines. And again, this just reinforces everything we've said. Starts with me. It's got to be built into our everyday educational practice. We've got to have action now. We have to hold people to account. How do we do that in a way that's not humiliating or shaming, and just honoring our relationship? And so in community, you know, we always start in community. I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Colleen, to help us finish off in a good way. And just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Oh, it's the mute thing. I don't know why.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can. Yep.
I just wanted to say thank you for the 99 participants that we had. We were at 105, you know, lunchtime came. Some of them probably, maybe they have a health issue and they have to eat. But just thanking everybody, and just even the company I have in my presence right now, that I could feel safe to even share this. Thinking of even somebody who's sitting here, who does massage work, who does healing work with her hands, But because of the way the society is, the way the health system is set up, is not accepted. But yet communities invite her out there and they bring her out for a week at a time. And they have to find the dollars. And thinking of the dollars that are earmarked, even like for research or for even the students, and it's not getting to them because institutions are saying, no, we need to use it this way. We need to use it this way. Meanwhile, these students have given their time, their life being nurses, yet they have families. To me, that's still unfair treatment, and it's happening today. And then thinking of, I talked about protesting, and I remember we had one even in Kamloops here, right on Seymour Street, where the post office was, the federal building in Kamloops then. In front of the post office, it was where our DIA office was, Department of Indian Affairs. And even that name has changed, but then their actions have not. They still kind of have this thumb, thing down. It's protesting, the dollars are not going to the education of our people. They're not going to the health of our people. They're not going for helping our people where the money was earmarked, but to management. And our people said, no, we don't need that. You need to do that. That office is not here anymore down Vancouver. We had students who at one time, they dressed the part, they put on the suits and they put on the tie and they had on their leather Oxfords that were carried in dust bags, but they made it into this office and they put up this big banner about education. But they got into that building. We don't need to do that. There should be no call for it to happen. Like I said, we should be able to sit at the table just like I'm sitting at this table now. And how many elders sat at this table and they even talked about water rights back then? And I remember even just down the road, and you come by this reserve, and it's a colonized word, even that word reserve. But one of the grannies had one of the meetings there, and they call it a general band meeting. Even that with that chief and council, that's colonized words. But then the people were the ones who chose, and it wasn't by an election that the government said, you have to elect this person. But the people, they knew who the leaders were, and they said, she is a fluent speaker. She has the history. They picked one of the men and they said, you pick out the men that you need to work with you, or the women that will take care of our water. At one time, the city had wanted to amalgamate our reserve, again, that colonized word, to become a part of them, but then we ended up being on Highway 5. And if some of you come through Kamloops, it's right by the Powell grounds. That highway, that opening is not there anymore, but our band office used to be right there. But our people stood on the highway saying, no, we will not be a part of the city. We have our own government. We know what our laws are, and our laws are back into the mountains. We had children that were the ones who came forward, and they were the ones that said, save the sockeye. Just a few years back, one of the nephews, he ended up cutting his hair because when the granny said, grandson, go do a ceremony. Show what must be done. And how were we to know that he was going to die of cancer? And then even thinking back, another protest that happened on our lands was right in front of the Kelms Indian Residential School building. And then Trudeau, the father, Pierre, had come along, and people were holding up signs saying no to the Constitution, because we were not even involved in discussions around that table. So when we look at a table and how important it is, it's very important. And like a brother said when he came here, he said, "Sister, I like how you've changed your ways and you've picked your place." So if we have to change our space around the table, then let us do that without fear, but that we have those ones that we look to our future generations are looking up to us. And like the other day, a little 5-year-old had that courage and was supported to say, "My name is Jasmine. I'm thinking of Buddy," and finding out who Buddy was because she loved Buddy and she had to mention him. Buddy was her little brother, and she's only 5 years old, and he passed away 2 years ago, but she has that memory at 3 years old that her little brother died. But to have the voice to say that, let us continue to have that voice in the heart to speak up truths that sometimes are hard to do. And with that, I say, Ulfmayawas, 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 forever, forever, forever. Yes, jokes.
Thank you so much. Hi, Colleen, Emily, Christina, Christine, and Lois. And on behalf of our Indigenous research chairs, we just really want to thank everyone for joining us and providing us the space to speak our truths and to come together and share how we must all now take action and responsibility for moving forward in a good way, because it is such exciting times. As much as nursing's in trouble, the other side to that is this potential to come out of that is pretty exciting.
Thank you so much to all our presenters for your wonderful knowledge today. I hope everyone that joined us was able to take away something that they can apply in their own institutions and with their colleagues. And it takes one person, and hopefully with that, collaboration can continue and the work can keep growing. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay, I wanted to just let Colleen know if she's there.